The other day, I got a comment on YouTube. In other news, it was recently revealed that the Pope is Catholic. Anyways, the commenter said this: knowing next to no Greek myself, this is just idle speculation, but I've wondered if all of the wonderful differences in things like the various words for love in the Greek New Testament fall apart when the text is translated from the Aramaic in the Gospels. Can Jesus have said something in a tense his language doesn't have? Now, I've heard this from commenters before, just as previous popes were also Catholic. I once wrote an article about Jesus' use of the diminutive form of dog, the equivalent maybe of doggy in Greek, in his delightful conversation with the Syrophoenician woman in Matthew 15. I had several people make comments like this one. Was the historical Jesus really speaking Greek with the woman? If not, then many things change about your study and conclusions. The other language many people think Jesus might have been speaking is Aramaic. This is me talking now. A language related to but distinct from Hebrew, and even more distinct from Greek. I tend to think that the Aramaic question is totally fair, but one that I find never has any firm answer and never gets me anywhere exegetically. When it does get me somewhere, as with some interpretations of "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church," I tend to think of it as cheating, as special pleading. The final form of the Greek text of the New Testament is what I have to deal with. In other words, I'm suspicious of the whole question of the role of Aramaic. What effect can it have other than to destabilize the Greek text that we in fact possess? When will we ever be able to uncover an Aramaic source text with any certainty, much less one that actually helps us understand the words of Jesus in the New Testament? I'm already too good at evading what Jesus told me to do. Love your enemies, give to him that asks of you. I don't need a temptation to doubt that the New Testament faithfully records Jesus' words. But it's not right for me to simply wish for Jesus to speak Greek because that would make me feel safer from challenge. So I did some study in my journals in Logos Bible software. This is precisely the kind of question that's too complicated for commentaries to handle and too narrow for monographs. So to journals I turned. And I was very happy to see one of the premier New Testament scholars of our day directly taking up my question. Stanley Porter, it was, in an article titled, "Did Jesus Ever Teach in Greek?" I will link his piece in the show notes. It was in the Tyndale Bulletin way back in 1993, the year the current pope turned 38, just so you know. I'm not going to do original research for this video. This is not idle speculation, though. I'm going to borrow from Porter, whose command of the primary sources far exceeds my own. I am going to list in detail the major reasons why Stanley Porter's answer to his own titular question was, yes, Jesus did, most likely, at least on occasion, teach in Greek. So clearly, Jesus spoke Greek. Porter says that, quote, evidence is increasing that Lower Galilee was the Palestinian area most heavily influenced by Greek language and culture. Porter cites several books, as well as this interesting article by eminent Roman Catholic exegete, though never pope, Joseph Fitzmyer, who writes, there are some indications that Palestinian Jews in some areas may have used nothing else but Greek. But Porter also points to evidence within the text of Scripture. We'll start there. Porter says, one indication of the pervasive influence of Greek is that in Acts 6:1, a distinction is made between Hellenistai and Hebraioi, probably a linguistic distinction made between Jews who spoke mainly Greek and those who spoke mainly Aramaic, or who also spoke Aramaic. Before the 3rd century AD, Porter goes on, these terms were virtually exclusively linguistic terms, referring to language competence. To distinguish those outside Palestine as Greek speakers would not have been necessary. It would have been assumed. But apparently there was a significant part of the population that spoke mostly Greek, even of those resident in Jerusalem. Next, Porter says, the 7 men appointed in Acts 6:5 to serve the Greek-speaking constituency, as deacons in other words, they all have Greek names. Third, Porter says, referred to as the Galilee of the Gentiles in Matthew 4:15, Lower Galilee was a center for trade among the Mediterranean, Sea of Galilee, and Decapolis regions. Galilee was completely surrounded by Hellenistic culture. Fourth, Porter says, Matthew or Levi, the tax collector in Capernaum, would probably have known Greek in order to conduct his duties with the local taxpayers and the tetrarch, Herod Antipas's officials. Many of Jesus' disciples were fishermen who worked the Sea of Galilee, including Simon Peter, Andrew, James, and John. they almost assuredly would have needed to conduct in Greek much of their business of selling fish. Porter's biblical evidence already bleeds over a little bit into extra biblical evidence, that is, evidence from outside of the Bible, but he gives some more of that too. He writes, quote, "More impressive than what is known even of Galilee for establishing the probability that Jesus spoke Greek is the epigraphic and literary evidence for the widespread knowledge of Greek throughout Palestine, including Galilee. That Greek was used not only in the diaspora, that is where Jews were scattered away from Israel, but also in Palestine, even for composition by Jews of distinctly Jewish literature, including much religious literature, indicates that Greek was an important and widely used language by a sizable portion of the Palestinian Jewish population. The mere existence of the Septuagint, of course, indicates that at least somewhere in the world there were a bunch of Jewish people who mainly spoke Greek, who apparently could not read biblical Hebrew. Porter also gives several examples of literary evidence for the use of Greek. First, he said, there have been a number of papyrus texts, including a number of fragments found in Palestine, written in Greek by Jews. The papyri, that's plural of papyrus, of the Judean desert include a wide range and variety of artifacts, such as commercial transactions, fiduciary notes, contracts of marriage, and fragments of philosophical and literary texts, among others. Second, so far as Jewish literature is concerned, there's also significant evidence of composition being done in Greek in Palestine by Jews for Jewish audiences. For example, the book of Daniel, besides using Greek names to refer in Daniel 3:5 to three musical instruments, that's the lyre, harp, and pipes, or so the NIV renders them, and being composed in Hebrew and Aramaic, in other words, Daniel has some Aramaic portions, in its deuterocanonical form, includes additional sections composed in Greek. Okay, follow me here. Daniel has a deuterocanonical form. There are additions to Daniel. And what language are they written in? They're written in Greek. That's the prayer of Azariah and the Song of the Three Children, Susanna and Bel and the Dragon, which are worth reading. Third, worth noting as well is the fact that although 2nd Esdras and Judith, these are apocryphal works, were written in Hebrew, they survive virtually entirely, or at least in significant part, in Greek versions, quite possibly reflecting Jewish linguistic priorities for preservation of religious texts. I mean, is that even possible? Can you compute that? People tend to think of Hebrew as the language of the Jews, and yet in the time of Jesus, apparently there were plenty of people, Jewish people, who were using Greek as their primary language, even for religious texts. Porter also gives examples from inscriptions. You know, this is like words carved into burial boxes and signage, etc. He says, the inscriptional evidence points in the same direction. There are a number of crucial texts that do point to the early and sustained widespread use of Greek in Palestine, and in particular in Galilee. For example, Porter quotes a scholar named Key, who says that when the synagogue movement began to flourish and to take on architectural forms in the 2nd century CE, that's of course after the time of Christ, but not that far after, the inscriptions were in Greek, even in Jerusalem. Now, for that citation, you're just going to have to read the article, of course. Another example of inscriptional evidence is this. Porter writes, the best indicator of the language of the common people is the sepulchral inscriptions, in other words, those bone boxes. And the evidence certainly indicates a widespread and constant use of Greek in Palestine, including especially Galilee. To put the evidence from funerary inscriptions into its proper context, it's worth noting that, according to the latest statistics on published inscriptions, 68% of all of the ancient Jewish inscriptions from the Mediterranean world are in Greek, 70% if one counts as Greek bilingual inscriptions with Greek as one of the languages. Porter concludes from all this, in the light of this accumulated evidence, which is overwhelming when compared to the equivalent Aramaic evidence, it's surprising that many scholars have not given more consideration to the hypothesis that Jesus spoke and even possibly taught in Greek. So what about Jesus' own speech as recorded in the New Testament? Does it point in the same direction? Porter thinks so, and so do I. He offers this evidence from within Jesus' own words in the New Testament. The first and most important example, and the one that sets the tenor for the subsequent treatment of passages, is Jesus' trial before Pilate. It's highly unlikely that Pilate, the prefect assigned to this remote posting in the Roman Empire, would have known any Semitic language. No translator or interpreter is mentioned for the conversation that occurs between Jesus and Pilate, making it unlikely that Latin or Aramaic was used. In fact, the pace of the narrative, in which conversation is held between not only Pilate and Jesus, but Pilate and the Jewish leaders, Pilate and the crowd, and the Jewish leaders and the crowd, argues against an interpreter intervening. It's most likely, therefore, that Jesus spoke to Pilate in Greek. And that brings us back to the diminutive Greek word for doggy and Jesus' conversation with the Syrophoenician woman. Porter actually cites this very passage, one I've pointed to as well, as a reason to believe that Jesus spoke Greek. He says, the first example of a passage in which Jesus may well have spoken Greek is Mark 7:25-30, when Jesus travels to the area of Tyre. A woman with a daughter possessed by an evil spirit hears of his presence there and begs for Jesus' help. The woman is called in Mark's gospel a Hellenist, a Syrophoenician by birth, that is, a Gentile. Even though the indigenous language of the area was Semitic, this area had long been under Hellenistic influence, in other words, Greek influence, and it was antagonistic to the Jews, and evidenced widespread use of Greek, as has been noted above. The description of the woman in the gospel makes sure that the reader knows that the woman was a Greek speaker despite her birth. Otherwise, the reference is gratuitous. In other words, why call her a Hellenist, a Syrophoenician? And Porter says there's no indication of an interpreter being present. So, did Jesus speak Greek? The New Testament does not directly answer all of the questions that we like to ask of it. But when combined with archaeological evidence, Porter concludes that the evidence regarding what is known about the use of Greek in ancient Palestine, including the cosmopolitan Hellenistic character of Lower Galilee, the epigraphic and literary evidence, including coins, papyri, literary writers, inscriptions, and funerary texts, but most of all, several significant contexts in the Gospels, all point in one direction. Whereas it is not always known how much and on which occasions Jesus spoke Greek, it is virtually certain that he used Greek at various times in his itinerant ministry. That's pretty much all, folks. I'll add only that I find it remarkable how little attention the New Testament pays to the languages that its figures spoke and understood. We monolingualists in English-speaking America do not at all take it for granted that people might know more than one language, quite the reverse. But many, many people around the world are multilingual. They're multilingual because they live at the confluence of cultures, some of which are more powerful, some of which are less. I have always felt sorry for the people who have to speak any language as a second language, and in my experience, of course, English, especially when it's primarily for economic reasons. If I had to do that, I would struggle so much to speak another language that's not my heart language. It would be humiliating for me to always be using a language I don't feel I'm so great at. That's how I feel when I speak Spanish. But then many people are native speakers of multiple languages. And I tend to think, given the evidence, that Jesus was one of them. I like to say around here that God has not anointed any one language as sacred. God is not a respecter of languages, but a speaker of them all. Indeed, the one who sustains them all, hears them all, and loves all the speakers of them all.